gain an education in a foreign country. You have a translator, but even with a translator, it's hard to keep up and be part of the conversation with your native language speaking classmates. There has been and still is a significant gap in the quality of education that hearing children receive versus deaf children. It has been documented over and over in the past and researched and studied that time after time deaf children lag substantially behind their age-appropriate peers in most all areas of academic achievement. To name a few areas of academic achievement where deaf children lag: spelling, paragraph comprehension, vocabulary, mathematical concepts and computation, social studies, and science are all areas that were found to be lower in measure considerably in deaf students that took the SAT. Also, another area of concern is reading. Reading is also an especially difficult task for deaf students because they learn to read in a completely different way. Because they cannot hear the language and sound out the sounds, reading comes to them in a completely different manner. So if they're in a mainstream school, it's really important that they have the resources and the reading teachers who know the appropriate way to teach them, since they do have a little bit different of a communication type. The average reading level of deaf high school graduates still remains at roughly the 3rd or 4th grade equivalent, and this is a graduate, a high school graduate. So they did graduate high school and pass, but their reading skills are still on the level of a 3rd or 4th grader. Now, there are a number of different factors that contribute to this educational gap that deaf students experience and have experienced in the past. The availability of interpreters is really scarce throughout the country. It's a really scarce field, and there's not a lot of educational interpreters who are qualified to be placed in the schools for these deaf children to facilitate their learning. Despite the increase of the number of interpreters employed in school, demand continues to outweigh supply, which continues to exacerbate efforts to monitor and improve the work of educational interpreters. More importantly than the scarcity of interpreters is the scarcity of qualified interpreters. Qualified educational interpreters are almost non-existent. School administrators like you often run into a dilemma in trying just to fill the position of educational interpreters. And when they're forced to just fill a position, they are also forced to sacrifice interpreting standards for deaf children in an effort to simply fill a position. A survey of 150 school administrators in the United States found that most never mentioned signing ability among the qualifications necessary for educational interpreters. So these school administrators are mostly concerned with filling the position, which is a hard decision to make because you want to have educational interpreters for your deaf students, but at the same time you want them to be qualified. Part of the issue of the education gap is also a lack of communication between deaf students, hearing students, and also teachers. The presence of an interpreter in relation to point 1 can aid in a hard of hearing or deaf student's learning, but it can also prove as a disadvantage. Keeping up in a mainstream classroom can be somewhat difficult for a deaf student, and most of the deaf students that we see, especially in this area, are in a mainstream school because the closest mainly deaf school is Tennessee School for the Deaf, which is in Knoxville, and that is about close to 2 hours away. So we're pretty far away from a completely deaf school. So most students here who have hearing loss are incorporated into a mainstream school. The reason that keeping up in a mainstream classroom can be somewhat difficult for a deaf student, even with an interpreter, is because students who use an interpreter must follow what's called a transliterated message, which is a message that lags behind the spoken one. So most of the time, deaf students are always a step behind their classmates because they have a third party who's having to translate from the teacher to the student. Also, hard of hearing students who use lip reading are likely to devote considerable effort to simply comprehending the message. This is to say, the students are not gaining the message of the teaching, but instead they're just trying to understand the message. And this takes a lot away from the educational environment and the education that they receive, because they're just trying to understand what's being said and not the material behind the message. Difficulties can also ensue for deaf and hard of hearing students when more than one student speaks at a time, which, as you know, as teachers and administrators, happens all the time. An interpreter only has so many hands and can only sign so fast, so the interpreter will have a problem interpreting people who are talking at one time. So a deaf student can miss out on a lot of conversation and classroom interaction just because of this fact. Social skills and peer interaction can also be affected by the presence or lack thereof of an interpreter. In regards to conversations with peers, deaf students often, when asked, report missing information, not catching each side of the conversation, only catching one aspect of a conversation with their classmates or their teacher, not understanding jokes, and failing to grasp the full effect of the conversation even with an interpreter present. So the interpreter is doing their best to convey the message of the conversation or convey when a joke is made, but sometimes, because the deaf or hard of hearing student does not use the same kind of language, it's hard to understand. At times, hearing students can be somewhat impatient or unwilling to repeat, and this fact has been known because deaf students and hard of hearing students have been asked, how do you interact with your peers? How do you think you are received by your peers? And this was their response. At times, hearing students are impatient or unwilling to repeat, which in turn causes frustration for the deaf student, decreasing the likelihood that students will engage or attempt to engage in conversation. So this impatientness on the part of the classmates and other children in your class and in your school as administrators and teachers really can have a big impact on the way a deaf student socializes, because if they have someone who's getting impatient with them, they're almost probably not going to try to communicate because they don't want to seem like a burden. As an educator and administrator, there are some important steps that you can take to help close the educational gap between hard of hearing and deaf students and hearing students. One thing that you all might like to consider to do is institute an educational program to help your faculty, staff, and educators accommodate students who have hearing loss. Allow the faculty members to gain work days by attending these educational programs. It's kind of a win-win situation. If the faculty is able to gain work days by spending time learning how better to facilitate hard of hearing students, then both parties win. The teacher gets a work day fulfilled, and the hard of hearing student may have improvements in their educational background. Have an interpreter come to your school and just teach some basic signs for future reference in the classroom. One thing deaf people and hard of hearing people report is how much they appreciate it when someone makes an effort to learn sign language, even if it's just a few signs. That shows that that person cares about communicating with the students in their classroom. Most hard of hearing and deaf students have had to adapt in some way or another to spoken English language. So it's important for you as teachers and administrators to make the effort. Show them that you care about them and you care about their educational background. Learn a few signs so you can try to communicate. Of course, the student will have an interpreter, but coming from you to the student, it will be really important. Incorporate proper etiquette standards when a teacher has an interpreter present. It's really important that a teacher know rules and etiquette and ways to treat an interpreter when they're in the classroom. Interpreters are taught that they are supposed to be invisible, which just means that they're supposed to convey a message from one person to the other with no interruption. This means that they are simply acting as a means of communication between the teacher and the student. The interpreter is not there to watch or help with the class. Their main job is facilitating communication for the deaf student. Have your teachers encourage interaction between hard of hearing deaf students and their peers. Interaction for deaf students is really important and can prove to be a challenge because of the language barrier. As teachers, it's really important that you encourage communication and interaction between these students because each student has a perspective to gain from the social interaction. This interaction will not only help their communication skills in general, both hearing and deaf students' communication skills, but there is also a chance that it may help the deaf student gain a better understanding of class assignments and expectations from someone other than their teacher. So it's an opportunity for deaf students to be able to talk to their peers and kind of understand what's going on in the class from another perspective besides the teachers. I know you all have a grasp on that. And lastly, something you can do as administrators and also teachers is provide support and encouragement for the teachers, faculty, classroom aides who have a student that is deaf. It can be really frustrating as a teacher to have a student who is deaf and sort of be stuck in a position where you feel like you can't communicate and you're not getting through to this student. So just provide some support and encouragement and let your teachers and staff know this is really important to us. We understand what kind of situation you're in, and we know. The educational gap needs to be closed between hearing and deaf students because everyone deserves the same quality of education. And just to kind of recap a little bit, there has been and still is a significant gap in the quality of education that deaf children receive. And there are a number of different factors that I have discussed that contribute to this educational gap for deaf students. Secondly, part of the issue of the educational gap is lack of communication, and we discussed the presence of an interpreter, and also fostering social skills for deaf students. And lastly, we discussed steps that you as teachers and administrators can take to foster the education of a deaf student. To ensure a better, brighter future for hard of hearing and deaf students, administrators and educators alike need to make it a priority to close this educational gap for the sake of deaf and hard of hearing students. Thank you.